welcome to AleksConnects Creative Sandbox. This is Tony, my name is Alex, and today we are kind of continuing to work with free visualization. Since I started to work on free visualization during the Russian streams, I didn't explain what exactly we're going to do in English, so I guess we're just going to today is going to be a rather short stream. I started a little bit later because I'm not feeling that well. I slept for only a couple of hours, kind of feeling pretty shitty. So because of this, basically, we're going to just basically work today around theory. I don't plan on doing that much today. I'm just going to talk, kind of brainstorm a little bit, and try to figure out how exactly we need to work with free visualization exactly for my personal use. Again, I talked before that on English streams about the concept of visual stages and the fact that we kind of created a simplified version for lighting purposes. We worked on simplification for anatomical accuracy purposes. You don't have to simplify necessarily in final rendering, so it's not necessarily that important. So the main three stages that I'm concerned with usually are the first three stages, because those stages are the most important ones. And one of the stages that I found myself that I'm not necessarily that efficient in or with, I don't know, is abstract and symbolic stage. This is the type of stage that basically will help me to visualize things easier, without that much of overthinking, without integrating too many theory into it, but basically focusing on something abstract and less controlled. Because again, the whole idea, as I said before, is to make sure that I'm going to work with all these things step by step. Let's just check the sound. Step by step. Let's just check the sound. Yeah. So the whole idea for me is to basically work with all those things step by step, not to put too much pressure on the first stage, not to push too much pressure on the second stage, and basically kind of delegate what we have to do in this stage, what type of complexity we have to meet in this stage. Again, the whole idea is it needs to be a clear idea, not necessarily executed well. I mean, because of this, I actually created this bad execution, which is not necessarily something that we will intend to do, but this is something that we actually will keep in mind. I mean, this is just to lift up the pressure from this stage. Again, I already talked about it, so again, if you're interested in that, let's just check previous streams, like a couple of less streams that we with simplification. We talked about it. We finished to work with simplification on Friday. I talked about the drapery, I talked about lots of stuff basically. Again, if you're interested, I could kind of revisit this thing in English, but for now we're just going to move on. Again, at some point we will talk about everything in details. Right now it's just like more about, like, again, revisiting things, trying to I don't know, trying to set your brain into a specific type of thinking, gradual thinking, and we're going to think from the simple to complex. Again, this is one of the things that I started to notice, like in my process. I don't have a proper process since I am a self-taught. I don't have a proper process of step-by-step kind of I don't know how to probably say it. So I don't have a way to go from simple to complex that well. I mean, my brain tries to visualize right away into, like, in complexity, and this is something that I want to kind of get out of, because this is not an efficient way to do things. Like, when you right away try to visualize something in its complexity, I need to basically focus on something super simple and actually create the step-by-step gradual complication, when we basically start with super simple thing, not focusing on anything quality. Like, I mean at this stage we're not thinking about quality at all. And why this is important, because all these things that I'm going to think about free visualization today are basically revolves around how to maintain this simplicity, what type of instruments we have to use in order to maintain this simplicity. So there might be a lot of problems with spelling, so hopefully we will check this during the stream, I guess. But either way, So the whole idea of this abstract symbolic stage is to find a simple way to simplify things. Basically, not to go more complex than this, not to go more complex than this. Basically, not to go to something like this, which is already too complex for the stage. This is something that we could apply for our second lighting purposes stage, because here we basically truly kind of analyze the form. We're working with primitives. We're trying to understand how these primitives set in lighting in order to relatively easy to change those lighting conditions and adapt our mannequin into those different lighting conditions, because the whole idea here is to basically find a way to work with lighting in a free way without getting too much complicated by details or too distracted by details. This is the reasons why we don't have details right here. Lighting works only with form and kind of primary and with shape secondary, because I don't want to overload it with details. Again, details, this is something we're going to work on an anatomical accuracy stage, and final rendering is going to basically focus on details the most, and kind of create a perfect balance between those three. So again, I don't believe that I have problems with final rendering stage. I also don't believe that I have problems with anatomical accuracy stage. It's all about just basically accuracy and spending lots of time in order to make sure that it's going to look believable and right. So it's not that big of a deal to actually work with this, with those kind of things. But one of the things that I'm kind of having trouble with is probably the abstract symbolic stage, because this is the most free stage, because it works with gesture, it works with feeling, it works with emotion. Lighting kind of the same, although with lighting we're working with form, and the form itself, it's not that, like the construction itself, it's not that big of a deal to create. The problem with lighting stage is going to revolve around trying to tell emotional stories with lighting. So this is the exact thing that we're going to kind of struggle, I guess, or at least I'm going to struggle. And since the next topic that we're going to talk about after we will finish this free visualization thing is going to be lighting, this is the next kind of fundamentals overview after simplification. And right now, while I'm preparing theoretical information and trying to find a way how we're going to attack lighting from now on, because again, there's multiple ways to attack lighting. There's a way to attack lighting from simplification standpoint, and there's a way to attack lighting from the final rendering standpoint. And I need to kind of find a way how exactly we need to approach lighting for now, not to get too complex in like rendering materials, but instead kind of find a simple way to work with lighting in order to implement those emotions and those feelings that we want to portray from lighting, with lighting. So because of this, basically lighting, it's kind of has to be a next stage. But while I'm preparing a lighting theory and kind of finding a way to attack it properly, we're going to sit on this first stage of like visualization, which basically I decided to call a free visualization, which basically means that it's a way for you to freely visualize something by feeling, not basically go into too much complexity, but try to do something like this, like basically work on feeling, like draw certain lines. So for instance, this is something that I drew yesterday during the test. I basically just created this type of shape right here, or not necessarily shape, but dynamic. And then I started to add inside of this dynamic thing a pose, and pose basically was created by itself. So I didn't have any intentions to create this pose. It was kind of a free thinking, the experimental way of working with these. This is something that I'm lacking in my work truly. I'm focusing too much on a controlled way of creating things, and I basically, it takes away from this experimental standpoint. And with this free visualization, this is exactly what I'm trying to solve. Again, these sessions are going to go in two formats. For instance, Friday we had a strictly theoretical format that I talked about things and tried to find a way how to approach this free visualization stage. We kind of overviewed everything here. And the second part, how these sessions are going to go, if viewers will join us, we're going to go into the draw pile and draw together and try to freely visualize. So for instance, during yesterday and Saturday, we actually drew this as an idea. So basically these are children playing with the pigeon, and this was the whole idea, and basically we both tried to visualize it on separate parts of canvases. This is actually quite a good idea. So basically we're drawing at the same time, one idea, and every person tries to create this idea their own way. And we're basically comparing the types of free visualization, what type of free visualization one artist uses and what type of free visualization I'm using, and that way it's basically helps me to figure out how I need to approach free visualization, what methods are people using, and what type of things that they're using I might apply in my work. Because again, this is something abstract, this is something strictly personal. This is the reason why I like stressing this element that it has to be created for personal use. It can be just something like that you take from the book. It could be something that you take from the book if you don't have to spend time on figuring this out. But again, it's better to try to figure this out. I mean, it definitely will benefit you if you will understand how to go with this first visual stage. Because one of the important things of the free visualization, it basically allows you to get the idea. So, like, imagine you have an idea. Like, for instance, right here, we had an idea or it's just Running Man. It's not necessarily more like an idea, it's more like I would say, a visual or aesthetic idea. We just needed to depict a certain pose and certain type of motion. We established this motion and we both tried to picture a running person in its extreme way, so like the extreme running. And we basically spent quite a lot of time sorry about that. Yeah, I'm not feeling well, as I said before. This stream is not going to be a long one. I probably will stream for an hour and that's it. So I kind of want to quickly cover all things. So yeah, let me launch a couple of things too. Okay, so yeah. So because of this, the whole idea is to make sure... Oh, snap. This is interesting. The stream kind of lagged in encoding. This is the first. Usually it's not happening. It seems like I don't have anything excessive launched. Weird. Either way, so again, the whole idea here was to depict this type of motion. This is basically a depiction of the certain motion, which still kind of considers as somewhat an aesthetic idea or the motion idea. It's still an idea. And right here, it was kind of a situational idea. So basically, these children are finding themselves in a certain situation, interacting with a certain something, which right here is a pigeon. Again, we could create like different variations of the story, how exactly these children will interact with children, what they're going to be their intent towards the pigeon, what condition of the pigeon is going to be, what type of story elements to add. This is basically something that we have to try to think already on this stage, because this is a free visualization stage where we basically have an idea, have a simple and truly simple description, and we're trying to make this description basically into something simple again, not focusing on the quality necessarily, but instead focusing on the clear idea. The idea that will be understandable personally for us only. Again, this is not something that we were going to show our art director or basically anyone else. This is something that we create for ourselves, for our personal purposes. So because of this free visualization, again, everything that I'm going to talk about free visualization, just keep in mind that this is just a personal way to solve free visualization for me. And this is by no means anything that has to be set in stone. I'm just using my own knowledge and my own understanding what we need to solve during this stage, what type of quality expectations I have from this stage, and what type of simplification I need to use. I'm restricting myself to using a certain type of instruments for right here, such as shape, such as gesture, such as kind of secondary form. And this is basically what I'm trying to find. Trying to find a way to abstractly and symbolically like integrate abstraction, which is basically kind of a intuitive design, I would say. Because again, abstraction for me personally, this is a way to make intuitive decisions, design decisions, and abstraction is nothing but trying to find your personal way of making these intuitive choices about the design in order for them to look right. So it's not something that it could be explained or judged necessarily. It's something a little bit more like vague and unclear sometimes. Symbolism, this is something that basically will help us to add this element of control, because again, abstract thing, it's pretty hard to control it, although we will try to do it through shape and through gesture. But still, in most cases, symbolic thing, this is something that will actually help us to add some type of recognition, or not necessarily recognition. It will make these things recognizable that we're going to work with. So, and the whole idea here is to truly make sure that whatever we're going to work with is going to be recognizable. So we need to deal with kind of a small elements of the proportion. So for instance, like create a poses that will fit to the characters, or create the poses and motion that is going to fit a certain situation. So this is kind of a subtle and small changes when it comes out to symbolic thing. We're going to talk about it in here. So again, and basically doing this, I completely understand that the whole thing about this first stage that we're still trying to figure out, this is a free visualization, is to find a way to simplify to the point that we will be able to portray a clear, but at the same time, simple idea. So it has to be simple. It has to be as simple as possible, but it kind of still has to be designed. And right now, I don't necessarily understand how exactly design it. So I know like what shape is separately, I know how to integrate gesture separately, but I still didn't connect them together. And this is what I will try to do in those type of sessions when we're not going to draw together with someone. So basically, this is kind of a theoretical thing when I'm just discussing and brainstorming how exactly to connect those things. So basically what I come up with is, again, I decided to look at free visualization as the idea or story stage, when the whole thing is to basically just represent a certain idea or tell a certain story using a certain instruments. And I established 3 instruments for us. So shape is going to be our primary instrument, and form is going to be our secondary instrument. Gesture, it's kind of necessarily, it's actually kind of related to the shape quite a bit. So there are kind of like debates that gesture is actually a part of the shape, but also gesture kind of has to work with form. So because of this, gesture is kind of a neutral. This is something that works in between form and in between shape. Because of this, I'm not setting it as a primary, nor am I setting it as a secondary. We basically, gesture, this is something that we have to adapt to both. So it's not one thing, it's kind of a both at the same time. So since gesture is kind of an open topic, we're going to discuss a little bit later, and maybe we will understand it a little bit better through this experience of trying to figure it out and come up with the way to visualize freely, again for personal use. We're going to establish a little bit better what gesture means, but in general I decided to divide them into 3 parts. So again, using this kind of thing, that it has to be abstract, it has to be symbolic, it has to integrate shape as a primary thing, it has to work with form as a secondary thing, and it also has to use gesture. And also it has to be designed. So combining all these 3 things and trying to find a way how exactly to design them in order to meet certain criteria, which is the idea has to be clear. I basically created this small kind of, I don't know, table, or I don't know how to probably say it. So basically, this thing I created where we have an idea as a centerpiece. This is something that we're going to work around. This is going to be our driving force. And then from this driving force, we establishing instruments, like overall instruments that we're going to use. Again, shape as a primary, something that we're going to focus the most. Form as a secondary, something that we're going to implement kind of not necessarily in an important way, but still we need to suggest it. And of course, gesture as a kind of a connection between both of those things. And then now we have the instruments. Now it's time to establish the way how to actually design them. So now we're basically creating a separate kind of categories that will explain how exactly we're going to use shape in this specific stage of free visualization. And I actually went through a lot of kind of iterations. I thought about how exactly we need to use shape, because shape is kind of a complex subject. I'm viewing shape as a part of the design. So every time that we're working with the shape, we're thinking about the design decisions. So for instance, one of the most kind of common design graphic forms that usually integrated in character design are those three. So basically rectangle, square, no, this is I forgot the names, come on man. Triangle, seriously. So yeah, we have triangle, we have rectangle or cube, yeah, basically just a rectangle, and we have a circle. These three shapes, again, these are the shapes. This is not something that has form to it. It's just a shape. This is something that is flat. We're basically going to try to use those things as a part of the design in order to first create associations. So let me just right away quickly check the English right here, because I might misspell things, and because of the wrong spelling it could be perceived a little bit differently. Associations. So no, it's actually right. So association, this is the first thing that we are concerned with. So when I'm talking about associations, this is something that basically creates kind of a way to familiar come on man, slept for 2 hours, sorry about that. Familiarize the viewer, so basically make an audience familiar with something that they're looking at. This is a way to basically create, for instance, this is kind of a pretty bad example, but again, we're trying to implement a shape decisions, like again, trying to design things, and talking about what type of associations it could bring in a person's mind. So for instance, if we're working with a pretty kind of slick and super skinny character that usually psychologically, culturally perceived as something that you can't trust, we basically could use a variation of the triangles in order to to make design decisions right here. And because of this, like integrating those design decisions, we will maintain this level of feeling. Again, we will add a controlled design decisions which culturally will be perceived a certain way. So basically this is the way to integrate symbolism. So again, associations, usually people associating themselves or with others or with something that they see by those type of instruments. They're working on the cultural and natural, which is basically made by nature, symbolism. So everything that has some sharp angles, this is something that we not going to touch. It's true in nature, it's true in culture. We're not going to try to get closer to a person who has like a haircut with a lot of spikes in it, with a lot of things that has spikes. It's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of intimidating. This is just a kind of way of psychologically feeling and making associations based on look. It's not necessarily going to be true, but again, this is something that we have to kind of utilize and make sure to know that we will know how to work with it. So again, creating a character, like making these shape decisions from which we're going to design the character. Again, we're not thinking about anatomy. We're not thinking about like how it's going to look in terms of the quality. The main idea is to capture the feel of it, capture the way. Seriously. Capture a way to look at this thing and tell, okay, I'm not going to trust this person because it kind of looks super angly and super sharp, and there is a like inside feeling that this person cannot be trusted potentially. Again, just as an example. So if we, for instance, like integrate this type of design into a character, again, this is super vague, but still, we're trying to create all parts of the character from kind of blocks that will give this character a certain kind of toughness or a certain type of, again, emotional feel. This is a way to use shape as a design thing. Again, the same kind of could work for a person that we could trust, like the person that created from kind of unharmed parts. It's not, again, this is super exaggerated. Ideally, we have to kind of find a way to make them a little bit more realistic, create a little bit more recognizable silhouettes, and etc. By the way, silhouettes and recognizable silhouettes that will work with symbolism. Symbolism is something that we're going to integrate too. So, for instance, like creating a haircut that is going to be quite sharp. Again, this is pretty interesting balance. Like, ideally, this character is supposed to be trusted because it's like super roundish and looks unharmful. But then we're kind of adding this element of contradiction, and it makes this character kind of confusing. That's kind of an interesting contrast. So again, basically using those things, again, I still don't know how exactly we're going to use them, but I still kind of want to think about it. Again, we are brainstorming. So yeah, basically talking about like associations, trying to find a way to add cultural or natural symbolism into our work using those basic shapes and their variations, of course. Let's just erase this one. So the second thing is basically a composition. This is the second way to use this shape, and this is something that we talked about during the last streams. This is kind of an open topic. I still don't know how exactly we're going to integrate it, but it basically kind of holds truth, this kind of method. When we're basically trying to create a certain shape composition inside of which we're going to place this character, and this compositional shape is going to dictate the motion, the overall character. It's basically going to either support the shapes that we chose for the character inside, and also it will again, supporting it, triangle here and triangle here, or contradict it when we're basically choosing a compositional decisions that contradict the internal shape. So internal shapes are triangle, and overall shape is going to be a circle. So this is kind of the way to think about it for now. Again, we will talk about it a little bit more details once I will understand how exactly we're going to work with it. So again, as I said before, right now what we're doing, we're trying to establish instruments that we're going to be able to use. And I'm not necessarily, like, I understand that using those informations will definitely be beneficial for this stage, but I don't necessarily understand how exactly we're going to use yet. This is something that comes with practice. This is one of the problems with free visualization. It's pretty hard to break it down theoretically. And this is why it's kind of super hard for me, because I'm a theoretical person, and for me working with theory is just much more simple than just diving into the practice and trying to come up with something like this or something like this, because this is not something that I can control. It might work one time, it might not work the other time. So this is not something that I have control of. So because of this, I'm basically using theory to find a way how to control those things. So for now, this is all about the shape. Again, shape has only two things: association, which basically is going to use shapes inside to basically make design choices, how we're going to create a shape for the head, how we're going to create a shape for the body, and etc. And compositional part of it, it's basically using the same thing, but using those shapes as something that surrounds this character and this pose. So again, a good example was right here. When I just basically create a shape, I created this type of shape, which still kind of considers the shape. It's open shape, it's not closed shape, but you can kind of debate that we could actually close it somewhere right here. So let's just imagine that this is our shape that is going to dictate our composition. So we created a shape inside of which we're going to now create this pose, and now we need to fit this pose and set the dynamic of this pose to fit this. Let's just make quite different choices, and yeah, now every design decisions that we're going to make, it has to support like these motions, which is of course not going to be an easy one. I don't know, it kind of will break everything. It's going to be hard to find the proper way to deal with this, but I will try to do my best. So again, I don't know what this person is doing. Again, we're not thinking about story right here necessarily, but still, this is a way to work with this. So now we have kind of the overall supportive dynamic like outside of the composition, and every decision that we're making right here, it's kind of the inside part that works with the association. This is something that basically much more complex, that like establishing the overall part of the composition is not that hard. You're just basically choosing a certain shape. Inside of the shape, you're basically utilizing a pose or motion, and etc. It's actually not that hard. Much more complex thing is to make a decisive design decisions, how to make this each part of this design fit the character, and support what character is doing, support and add this character without necessarily focusing on overall look or on details. So finding a general way to simplify this character. Now, this is kind of one of the things that we need to think about when we're dealing with this subject. So again, to repeat myself, overall shape, this is a compositional part when we're basically trying to solve a problem of composition, which is an element of storytelling, but still kind of technical to some degree. And also we have an inside things and making choices inside this shape. So what type of shapes we're going to use to create our character. Again, we're not necessarily thinking about the form here. We're thinking about the shapes that has to support the direction, that has to support a behavior, and etc. And again, it's not an easy thing, but this is something that we need to find a way to work with. So yeah, again, bad example, but still hopefully it's clear. So this basically means that we kind of finished with shape for now in terms of the theory. So now we created a theoretical instruments that we're going to use to like trying to find a way to integrate them into this stage. Again, it's not going to be easy, but this is something to consider. We have to think about associations. We have to create some type of with these simple forms, with these simple shapes, we have to find a way to tell a story even at this stage, but not go into details. So again, we need to find a way to make like good design decisions, which is kind of intuitive. But in order to make it a little bit more controlled, we're going to look at it from the standpoint of the cultural and natural symbolism. Something that we, for instance, perceive in some way in the nature, we're going to use here. So for instance, again, as I said, sharp things are going to be something that we're not going to necessarily be fond of. This is something that we kind of have to be scared about and scared of. Something round, this is something that's huggable. We would like to have something round around us. This is something that basically creates safety. This is something that could be reliable, could be unstable, or no, the opposite. It could be stable, it could be also stupid, etc. Again, these are just associations that those shapes are usually create. And again, there's a lot of information in the internet what type of associations are created by each of those shapes, especially if you will get into the character design. There's a lot of associations, like how we could perceive a triangle. Based on the placement of this triangle could be perceived as an unstable thing, or because again, it's standing on its point, which means that it's unstable. It could fall at any time, which basically adds a psychological instability. We could make it a little bit more stable, but still, although it's stable, it's still kind of unreliable because it has this sharp angle and someone could pierce through it. So it's not safe. So again, these psychological things we kind of will try to think during this stage about. So again, it works with associations and with cultural and natural symbolism. And composition, this is something that is a little bit more complex, of course, but since we need to find a way to integrate composition already, and using shape, it could be a good idea. Basically, choosing a regular shape like this could tell us how exactly we're going to place the character inside of the shape. By making this shape, of course, a little bit more dynamic, we could create a potential kind of direction for our character. So choosing this kind of a simple shape, we could already create the dynamic for our character, and then using those things to put the character inside of something like this. So again, the composition is something that basically inside of which character is standing, and again, associations to something these design decisions that we're going to make inside. So let's just move on. So form, since again, since this is our primary thing, we actually need to kind of go through a lot of tests to actually learn how to do this, how to implement those associations and composition into our designs and into our stories, how to tell idea. It could be a storytelling idea, it could be an aesthetical idea, just basically something that looks pretty. We need to try a way to integrate it. Приветик, Бобу, как делишки? So yeah, and basically this is kind of a way for us to work with it. We're just trying to find a way to work with shape, and this is something that is going to be a hard one, because again, it's a primary thing. It has to be controlled pretty well in order for it to work. At the same time, form, it's something that is much more easy. So since form is secondary thing, I specifically kind of cross-hatched it in order to make it unimportant or less important. With form, we don't want to think about how this form is going to, again, we don't want to create this type of depiction of the form when we're creating form lines, when we're trying to analyze its position in space by creating a lot of form lines and etc. This is not something that we need in this stage. Again, since we're working with shapes, most of our sketches are going to look something like this. They're rarely going to use any form lines. Again, we still kind of could suggest that we see in form right here, we see in space, but we're not using a regular instruments to work with the form. So what we're using instead are kind of a graphical way to create an illusion of space, which means that in form we need to focus on only one thing for now, and this is a spatial placement. Let's just establish if it's right or wrong. I believe it's not. Spatial. It's awesome. I guess I'm spelling things right. Placement. I don't believe that placement is right. Placement. No, it's right too. Pretty cool. So spatial placement, this is something that we need to find a way to create an illusion of the form. But again, since this is a secondary thing, we don't want to make it we don't want to make this form overpower our primary shape. And because of this, what I mean by overpowering, for instance, right here, we don't have any depiction of the space using a form. If we want to establish form right here, it will start to overtake the shape. And basically, at some point, we're going to lose ourselves with too many lines, and it basically is going to lose the whole dynamic. In order to maintain this dynamic, or at least this is the way that I'm looking at it, I want to get rid of the form depiction right here, so I will try not to use this form depiction. And instead, what I want to do is to use those shapes and use certain kind of methods to work with creating an illusion of space by just creating overlapping, which is this. So basically, when one subject overlaps the other subjects, this is a way to showcase the space. Again, we use it right here. We created this character, and this character overlaps the character behind it. That way, we basically make sure that the one character is deep in space, the other one is closer to us. Of course, size, it could be used as kind of a way to make things right. So for instance, this kid is approximately the same size as this kid, but it looks smaller because it's deeper in space. Let's just basically establish that this is something to think about too. So overlapping, foreshortening, basically foreshortening, it's kind of the same. So I guess foreshortening, it's when you integrating perspective by making one part of the subject on one subject bigger than the other. So I guess when we work with foreshortening, it could be used two ways. First way is within one subject, when we're basically taking a cylinder and making one part of the cylinder bigger because it's closer to us, and the other part of the cylinder smaller and narrower because it's deeper in space. And that way we will create an illusion of space without necessarily integrating an actual form. Again, we're not going to create form lines. We're just integrating kind of a silhouette that depicts how it's going to work. The other way to integrate foreshortening is to use scaling. Again, let's just establish that scaling works too. So foreshortening and scaling, that kind of will work the same. Wait a minute. Everything's right. So yeah, we don't have that much time, so hopefully I will be able to finish in time. So again, we're not going to stream that long today. I'm not feeling that well. So again, spatial placement, we're basically going to work with overlapping, which is again when one subject overlaps the other. Again, we used it right here when one character overlaps the character behind it. Right here we used overlapping to set this hand somewhere right here. So we kind of, it's already creates an illusion. It's actually rather wrong placement, but still. Again, we're just picturing that this arm is basically goes there, and the fact that we create this overlapping basically supports it. And a lot of overlapping like this, for instance, like this type of overlap when this part of the leg hides this part of the leg, and etc. So this is basically using the shape, or right here, a part of the shoulder overlaps the head, and we're not seeing the whole head, like basically viewing only part of the head. So this is basically the way that we're going to use our overlapping, scaling, and foreshortening. Again, just making things a little bit smaller in space, deeper in space, and add illusion of form, but not thinking about this as a primary, again, secondary. And because of this, we're not going to use too many instruments. Another way to depict the form, this is just a personal way for me to depict the form, is to create a sense of direction. For instance, if I in order to not create lines that will establish form, instead I rather will do something like this. I will basically create this kind of thing that will help me to understand which direction this character is looking at. So something like this basically we will try to use. Maybe with these type of like directional lines, like okay, this one goes there, this character looks there. Because instead of just working on details, I kind of just want to find a simple way to tell a story inside of this thing. It's actually going to work right here in dynamic and storytelling, when we're basically going to create a certain scene, and inside of this scene we're going to try to establish the motion, where things are looking. So it kind of works a little bit with working with direction. But right here I will use direction more like a perspective, like a form aspect again. Just making sure that where exactly this character is looking at to kind of establish the direction. And based on that, of course, it will help us to make certain changes if the look is going to change. Again, this is just a much simpler way for me to understand where exactly a person is looking at. Because if I'm going to just create the center line, it still not necessarily tells me where exactly person is looking. It could look there, it could look there, it could look there. It's not necessarily tells me anything. Now I need to create an additional line in order to support this movement. And again, it's just too many lines that will now overtake from the shape and adds too much complexity to the form itself, which is not something that I need to do in this stage. Again, the whole point of the stage is to focus on the shape and make just form as secondary. So because of this, I'm just making kind of a personal decision to, where it was, to, instead of creating all those form lines, just find a simple way to depict this thing separately. And now I know where exactly this head is looking at. It's just kind of a indicator that will help us to create an illusion of form or space, the sense of direction, where things are looking. So yeah, this is kind of one thing. And for now, when it comes down to the form, I believe we don't have that much in the form. Again, we have two things in shape. Association part, which works with cultural and natural symbolism, using original graphic shapes, and also composition, which basically is going to use the same original graphic shapes, but outside of the, basically like an overall composition. Okay, so yeah, right here we have basically two things, and they're going to be primary, so we're going to like focus on them the most, and this is something that could be secondary. Sometimes we could like integrate overlapping. Usually it's just going to be more like a functional decision, right? So for instance, right here, in order to make sure that they're going to look a little bit more interesting, I just going to use overlapping. Like this hand is going to overlap the part of the body, this hand is going to overlap this part of the body, and etc. So basically just like for instance, this knee is foreshortened. Yes, it goes in space a little bit deeper, and the placement of this knee right here as overlapping and at the same time creates an illusion of foreshortening. So they kind of work in combination. So, and the last thing that we're going to talk about is gesture. So gesture is kind of a complex topic. Again, I'm still like, as I said before, like to repeat myself, that gesture, it's not necessarily a primary thing, it's not necessarily a secondary thing. Gesture, this is something that connects both. So ideally gesture, this is something that helps us to work with storytelling. And because gesture works with storytelling, we need to work with gesture. So the first thing that we're going to consider about gesture, it has to be all the time exaggerated. So let's just make sure that I properly spelled it. Exaggeration. Nope, wrong. Double G. So right here we're basically considering exaggeration. Yep, exaggeration. So basically, this is a way to make a still dynamic look a little bit more dynamic. So again, if we have a character that kind of a little bit static, we're just creating a much more curved line to make sure that this gesture is going to be more intense. Again, the whole idea of this is to portray the idea and the story element, the emotion, the uncontrolled, abstract aspect of feeling what we're drawing, not necessarily making it look good. Because of this, we have to exaggerate. So we also basically will work with exaggeration of the shape. So for instance, instead of just drawing a regular shape, we will try to make sure that the shape is going to be quite exaggerated with gesture. And we're going to make this shape a little bit more dynamic looking. And it will create much more kind of overall feel to it. So again, as I said before, gesture is going to affect shapes and it's going to affect forms. Basically, actually, it's going to affect shapes more than form, but still. The problem with gesture, though, gesture has to work in conjunction with something. It cannot work on its own. So if you think that you're creating a gesture by just doing this, it's not necessarily a good approach, because you're just drawing a stick figure with a lot of kind of directional lines. Ideally, each part of the gesture has to be supported by shape in order to make it look good. And if you don't have it, it's just basically a stick figure. So because of this, we're going to talk about like connection of the gesture and shape a little bit later. But again, this is something to think about, that it's not working separately. It has to work in cohesion with shape. Let's just, by the way, establish this as a kind of an important thing. Again, it's going to work with shape kind of a secondary, so because of this, I'm not going to make it super evident. So this is something that I still need to think about. I'm not sure how exactly it's going to work with form in this instance, but it's definitely going to work with shape. So with shape, it's 100%. But with form, I don't know. Maybe the direction aspect, maybe the overlapping aspect. I don't know. I don't believe that gesture is going to work with form right here in this stage. It's more going to be combined to the shape more than to the form. But again, if we would work on integrating gesture based on the shape or on the form, then gesture would connect to the form more than to the shape. again, this is something that we're going to talk about later. I don't have a clear vision how exactly to explain it yet. So yeah, so again, exaggeration, this is the first thing that we need to think about the gesture. That basically will help us to create more dynamic feel. Because again, because I exaggerated this type of tilt, we have a dynamic. We have a quite understanding what this person's intentions could be. Because we created those dynamic kind of transitions, we could tell from this simple sketch what potential intentions of this kid could be. So for instance, this cat tries to touch this pigeon or whatever is right here. This one is just basically waiting a reaction. It's passive. We looking at his arms placed on its knees and etc. So again, it's all about trying to visualize by this kind of dynamic lines, trying to think where exactly the motion is going to look at, where exactly those people are looking at, how the overall transition is going to happen, how the storytelling happens inside of it, which is a part of the gesture that is actually going to work with dynamic. This is something that will help us to add to the body language. Again, it kind of works with exaggeration too. Exaggeration is more like a general rule, just think that we have to exaggerate things. And how to work with exaggeration is basically adding a dynamic to the body language. So again, if we have a certain pose, we have to make this pose, push this pose to extreme. If we're looking at just the kind of a static pose, for instance, a character just, I don't know, standing like this, again, we're going to go with super bad examples, but still, if character is going to stand like this, we need to push this pose. We need to push this much harder. We need to make sure that this character is going to be kind of over tilted, and the overall, like the chest is going to be popped out a little bit better, bigger. The leg is going to go further, and basically we're creating the same pose, but making it much more dynamic. Again, we're not thinking about super believable things right here, but still. So again, it could be the same pose. Again, it could tell the same story. There's no story here, but still. But it's much more exaggerated. And because it's much more exaggerated, it helps us to add this dynamic to the body language. Another way to use dynamic right here, again, through the exaggeration, is adding dynamic to the storytelling. Dynamic through the storytelling is basically creating and placing things the way that they're going to attract viewer to a primary focus. So for instance, again, good example with this, this work has primary focus that every person is going to look, in most cases, right here. This is the place where every viewer is going to end up with, because this character is looking there, this character is looking there, also there is intention to go and touch it. This character, again, it's not necessarily looking at the pigeon, but it looks right here, which kind of already creates this kind of storytelling dynamic which goes right here. So this is a way to integrate composition, by the way, too. Integrating like a dynamic into the composition and trying to tell the story through this line of kind of storytelling. Again, with body language, we're using a line of action, which basically a line in which this action is happening. So now it kind of tells what type of action character is taking. So line of action basically is going to be used in body language, and a line of storytelling, which is just a personal way of explaining it, is going to use we're going to use to tell the story. It's just going to create kind of a storytelling throughout this. So for instance, this pretty bad example, I'm visualizing is this one as two people sitting at the table, one from one side, the other one from the other side. This person a little bit more relaxed, this one a little bit more kind of condensed, but they both look at whatever is happening right here, and all this dynamic has to support this motion. So something like this. Again, we're going to talk about it in a little bit later, once we will figure out how exactly to work with it. So again, that's it for now. I mean, I don't think that we need to add anything else. I still kind of in search. I still need to find a way to connect those pieces together. But again, I don't want to make this thing too complex. I still need to make sure that it's going to be as simple as possible. And considering the fact that design aspect, it's super complex and shape is just one part of it, I believe that we took two pretty important roles of the shape in this first free visualization stage, which is, again, has to be clear but simple. It doesn't have to look good. It doesn't have to look realistic. We're using gesture, we're using shape as a primary, we're using form as a secondary, and we're connecting those things through the gesture. We established how exactly we're going to design them, how we're going to design gesture, how we're going to design shape, how we're going to design form. Again, just to repeat myself, we're going to design shape with adding associations to it by basically making a, I don't know, right and proper decisions what type of shape we're going to use for each part of the body, which will support the character, which will add this cultural and natural symbolism to it. It also will, of course, add to a silhouette too, so this is where silhouette works quite a bit too. And the other way to integrate a shape is to work with composition, which is, again, just basically taking the overall shape and making sure that this character is going to fit this shape and support the shape. Again, it could be supporting, like triangles inside and triangles outside, or it could be contradicting when we have triangles inside and something quite spherical outside. This line, by the way, the compositional line is going to be invisible, so it's something that we just have to picture in our mind like a print. Again, most things, when it comes down to the composition, they are invisible. Composition, one of the reasons why composition is pretty badly explained throughout all books, there's almost no proper books that actually explain composition that well. It's kind of like works around certain topics, thinks about the theory of composition, about the golden ratio and other weird stuff that's not necessarily works every time. Composition is something that it's pretty hard to capture. This is something that you capture from feeling. This is something that you capture from experience through understanding what's good for story, what's good for body, for telling, like making this pose look right. So this is something that is pretty hard to capture. But again, for instance, right here, we could look at, again, there is a composition in here, and I believe this composition is going to be quite, I don't know. So the composition probably will fit something like this. So like the overall compositional aspect is in here, and the rest is just going to go inside. And then we could create storytelling inside of this composition. Make sure that we're going to end up where we started from, like in the face when we're working with the character. So again, this is kind of a vague concept. I still trying to think about, like, find a good way to explain it and visualize it. So again, for now it's a concept, and before we will turn it into an actual way of problem solving, like adding shape as a composition, it will take time. But I believe this is a way to add composition into the stage too. So again, association and composition. This is our instrument of design. This is the overall instrument, and this is how we're going to use this instrument to design things, to intentionally make decisions and not just randomly sketch or draw, whatever. Again, just finding a way to control things. Our form thing is, again, we talked about it. One thing that we're concerned about the form is just the overall spatial placement, which we're going to create an illusion of by overlapping shapes, by scaling and foreshortening. So again, foreshortening, scaling. So understanding that everything in space becomes smaller the deeper it goes in space, and the same aspect is true to this, but just as separate subjects, which looks more like a scaling. And again, if we're working with multiple subjects, it's perceived as scaling. If we're working with one subject, it's perceived as foreshortening. And the other way is just a personal way for me to describe the form without creating too many lines. As I said before, is just to set a specific direction for certain parts of the body. In most cases, the only place for this type of direction is head, because in most cases, you kind of understand the direction for this arm, you will understand direction for this arm, you will understand direction for this, because our limbs already create direction by their dynamic. Head doesn't necessarily have this dynamic. Again, it's just a freaking ball for now. Again, later we will integrate better design decisions. Again, working with the better shapes, creating a shape that will create a little bit better looking head, add this dynamic to a head, not making it too simple, so making the shape a little bit better, something like this. But this is something that we need to basically practice. So this method is more used for something that doesn't necessarily has a direction, clear direction. So for instance, for heads, I believe we're going to use this. What else we're going to use it for? I guess just for heads, because it kind of seems like a quite interesting idea, just to create this kind of the direction where exactly this thing is facing. Again, you could do it outside of the shape, not to mess with it, on a separate layer, and kind of create a connection. Or you could do it right on top of the shape. Could work too. Again, just as a personal way. Maybe we're not going to use it, who knows. But for now, this seems like a logical thing to do. Okay, so for instance now, this guy direction I showed by establishing this line. So it kind of looks, it seems like it's he or she, doesn't matter, looks somewhere out there. So the overall direction for this head is probably goes somewhere kind of deep in space, goes there. So yeah, something like this. So this is a way to secondary work with form. So again, form, this is our overall instrument, like a somewhat theoretical instrument, and then we have a ways to use this instrument. So again, this is just an instrument itself. This is the way, what type of information we need to use to make sure that this instrument is going to be utilized the way that we want it for the idea purposes. The same goes for shape. Again, shape, this is just an instrument for us, and this is the thing that will help us to use this instrument well. Again, as I said before, shape, such as form, there are much more complex, but I just trying to find a way to not overcomplicate things. And I believe by adding association right here, by integrating those shapes, and composition, by integrating those shapes outside. So again, we're working on the outside composition, and we're working on the inside composition. So inside composition or inside design is going to be how we're going to design those shapes, and composition is going to be something that's what type of shape is going to overly be represented. Is it going to be something like this? Which is again probably not going to work because these things are going to be round. These things are going to be round too. So again, this is something that you're not going to necessarily draw. It's more like a picturing inside your brain, or draw it as a separate layer, and again, it's not a silhouette necessarily. It's more like just a general shape that, if we're going to separate this general shape from overall thing, it could tell us something, like just emotionally, like the overall design of the shape. So like imagine that you don't have this character inside of it, just this shape on its own. Like what type of feel this shape has. Again, this is a super abstract thing. I guess with time we will learn how to control it. But for now, let's just keep it as an option. Composition definitely has to be integrated in this level. Okay, yeah, we're going to get stream closer to the end. I guess maximum we're going to stream for 30 minutes more. Again, I slept only a couple of hours, kind of tired, and we also kind of talked about most of the things here. So now it's all about practicing those things. So we established ways to deal. I also didn't talk about gravity, completely forgot about the balance. So again, exaggeration, this is something, again, to repeat myself, to help us to exaggerate weak poses and make those poses a little bit more dynamic, which again connected to the dynamic thing. Dynamic is going to be perceived as a body language and as a way of telling a story. So that way we're going to know that in order to tell a story with the body, we need to utilize gesture as a body language. So again, we're going to try to explain how exactly those arms are going to be placed, why exactly those arms are going to be placed, like their dynamic, their overall feel, direction. So all those sorts of small things are going to be explained in this kind of a dynamic thing in body language. Storytelling aspect, as I said before, this is something that is going to be explained inside of the composition, just something that it could tell the story inside of it. And gravity or balance, this is something that will just help us to add a little bit more believability to it. Because, for instance, this pose is definitely doesn't have a balance. It's not properly balanced. We need to properly balance it. And this is more like just a thing that you have to notice. It's not something that could be trained. We tried to talk about balance yesterday when we during the Russian stream with the IG shoe, but it was kind of a topic that is pretty hard to grasp and control. This is something that you just have. I mean, for instance, this person, we know that like gravity pulls and there is a weight distribution between all those parts. So gravity pulls from the crotch area usually, and from this area the rest things are helping balance this thing, and it's something that you just have to feel. So for instance, this person is crawling or trying to find something on its floor, so it's already kind of creates an element of the story, although we don't have that much of an information right here, and we could perceive this any type of way. I mean, we could perceive it as just a regular again, person tries to like prepares for running. That way, of course, I believe the dynamic is going to be a little bit different. In order for this person to prepare for running, we have to place its head a little bit higher and probably change something. I don't know. So again, these small adjustments that basically will work with gravity, with weight displacement, and how properly create this balance, and not to make our character just constantly falling, because again, like bad example of balance right here, we don't have a balance. This person is basically falling. It's like a drunk person tries to stand on his own feet, but it's basically failing. It doesn't have a necessarily gravity element. Like all limbs are randomly placed in a random position, and because I didn't thought about gravity, I basically disregarded this element of gravity right here. And if I will think about it, I will make a little bit better decisions, and will place things based on how this person potentially could stand. Like, not to like, this is probably going to be a bad example, but still. How to make this person stand on his own feet and not to basically sit in the air. In these small things, this is something that we need to think about. Now it's a question how exactly we need to integrate those things, which is not going to be an easy one. Okay. Just quickly redo a couple of results. So it's a weird pose, it doesn't have a dynamic, but at least it's a little bit more grounded. It seems like person at least stands. It's still pretty bad. So it's something that you will solve by looking at the nature and trying to... It's more like a feeling. I mean, you know that this person is out of balance. It's all about establishing how exactly to make sure that this balance is going to work. It's, I don't know, it's not an easy one. You have to kind of create a proper weight distribution, consider what's part of the body feels. Maybe it's kind of distributing masses. I mean, you're creating a center point, then maybe you will try to separate everything into masses and try to create a certain equality between both of these masses, because the bottom part, I believe, always have to I believe they weigh a pretty similar weight, although it all depends on the complexity, and I don't believe this is true. No, it's not true. but still, it might be true. So let's just imagine that this part of the body weighs the same as this part of the body, just as an example. And that way we will be able to make sure that they're going to be balanced properly. And this is kind of a way to simplify this weight distribution. So again, when our forces are shown in a dynamic, it's much harder to find a distribution because they are in a certain action. So for instance, this running guy is just running. It doesn't necessarily has a distribution. It's all about just analyzing the motion and trying to understand the counter weight. So these, like for instance, this leg is going to go that way, the opposite hand is going to go, like hand from the same side is going to go the opposite way. So if we're running, we can't run parallel. We basically running unparalleled, I would say. So these small kind of analysis that we're going to try to implement right here. So yeah, this is kind of the thing that I wanted to talk about. I don't believe that we're going to draw too much. So one thing that I will talk about though is just basically set our mind into how exactly we need to solve those problems and how we need to approach them, and then we will start to get stream to an end slowly. Still kind of trying to make sure that this character is going to look a little bit better. I don't know what's happening right here. It's still again out of balance. This one stands on its own feet. Like this character actually has balance. Sometimes it just looks by feel. This character has a pretty decent balance because his main weight is placed on this leg. I believe one of the legs is actually could be a little bit deeper in space, somewhere out there. Probably it's going to look a little bit better than this, because that way this person could actually fall there. But because there is a kind of leaning towards, it distributes weight for the bottom part of the body closer, and also this leg is balancing things out, and this hand helps to maintain this balance. So again, there's a lot of things when it comes down to the gravity and to the balance, but this is something that we need to think about, because if we're not going to think about balance and gravity, all our poses are going to be just flying in space, and it's going to basically look something like this, like when we have a head, when we have legs in the different positions, and arms in different positions. So again, it's super over exaggeration, but still. This one doesn't have a balance. This one doesn't have balance. This one kind of has balance, but not enough. So again, so the whole idea right now is to find a way to now integrate our shape as a primary thing, trying to find a way to combine our shape and design, or shape and gesture, and find a way to add a form as creating an illusion of reality. So to sum things up, I believe that design is going to be looked as, or shape is going to be viewed as a design. Let's just establish that I'm going to perceive shape as a design aspect, and especially the thing that works with associations. And composition, it's still going to be a kind of a part of the design, but it's still, it's going to be a way to control the design. Something to think about. So again, in most cases, shapes this is a design thing. It basically works with design the most. Gesture works with storytelling, so this is the way to mainly tell the story. So gesture is basically going to be storytelling. Let's just establish that. We kind of already created the storytelling aspect here, so let's just establish that gesture is a storytelling. Let's just set it in here. Yep, so gesture is basically a storytelling aspect of things. Let's just set them as a similar thing. Set them quite apart. Gesture, this is going to be our storytelling, and the form is going to be a way to create a delusion of reality, I guess, just a technical thing. So again, this is more like a theoretical thing, this is more like theoretical thing, and this is why it's super abstract, because it's pretty hard to control those things, and this is the only thing that we will be able to control. It's basically illusion of reality. So this is kind of a technical aspect which we will be able to control quite a lot. So I don't believe that we're going to struggle with spatial placement. Again, using overlapping, such as right here, this hand is overlaps this part of the body, this part of the leg, and continues there, and then goes under the leg. Leg overlaps this part of the arm, and etc. So, of course, this is something that you have to study too and understand how to work with it. But still, it's kind of a little bit simpler than to work with something abstract. It's because again, working with the shapes kind of still seems pretty uncontrollable. It comes with the practice and kind of visualizing things. I don't know. I truly don't know how exactly to implement this one. It's definitely kind of makes things a little bit more complex than I would want to. But I believe what will help us to solve this problem with the shape is the gesture. So whatever the gesture is going to tell us to move, we're going to create shapes that will support this gesture. So for instance, if we want to create this type of dynamic, we could support this dynamic by improving this movement. So for instance, let's see, if we're going to create a direction and the overall direction is going to be there, in order to make it more evident with the shape, basically connecting the shape with the gesture, is to make sure that it is going to support the same direction by making this part a little bit wider and this part a little bit smaller. So that way we kind of have a direction that continues to go there. This is one way that we could make design decisions based on the gesture. So since this one doesn't necessarily has a direction, we could make it a little bit more neutral. Then once we will go to the something directional, we will continue to add those directions. So again, this one supports direction. So again, it's definitely going to be not an easy subject to talk about, but again, hopefully I will find a way to control it again. This is something that I have to learn how to do because again, as I said before, we have about like 5 minutes till the end or 7. One of the ideas right here is to just find a way to work with abstraction and symbolism and shape. Again, not to focus on necessarily form, not to focus on details. Again, we will have time to work with details, and we will be tired from working from details. There's 2 stages that details are so kind of complex that we're going to bore ourselves with those details. In order to make each part of the creation process fun and interesting, I specifically separated those parts. So again, I talked about it previously that I'm separating our abstract symbolic part from lighting part, and only then I indirectly add them into our anatomical accuracy as a guide not directly, but again, indirectly as a guide. We're not going to draw over them, we're just going to use them as a guide to implement the same type of feeling, the same type of lighting into the anatomical accuracy. So by separating those things, first thing that I'm doing is I'm lifting the pressure from my first idea stage, which will make me much more free in experimentation. Again, it will help me to conceptualize, to freely visualize whatever I want, however I want, without being pressured by the lighting stage, in order to make sure that we're going to like create a super awesome form. Again, screw the form here. We're focusing on the shape. And because we're focusing on the shape, we need to understand like how to master the shape. And also it's going to be a good practice. Like, it seems like we're not going to use this shape that we're going to come up with on this stage, because again, we're going to use it indirectly for now. But again, it's going to help us to design well. It will help us to work with simplification when we will get to the actual character design better. It's all kind of a gradual, logical, step-by-step process that, even if we will spend a lot of time on this free visualization subject before we will get to lighting, which I believe I will do, because I don't want to rush in right away into the lighting. I understand the importance of the first stage of the visualization, because again, this is the stage where, wait a minute, where, this is the stage where, seriously? Okay, found it. Wait a second, it's opening. Here it is. So this is the stage where we're going to go through the most intense brainstorming, I would say. Because this is the stage when we basically have an idea. We kind of describing this idea. Maybe we will search through references, maybe we will add these kind of additional information. Again, this is an optional thing. For me, optionally, I will probably add those things. But what I will try to do, what I'm trying to do right now is to try to find a way to visualize things a little bit more freely. So we're kind of coming up with an idea. We're describing this idea quite vaguely. Then we're trying to understand this idea a little bit better by putting a little bit more information. Then we're trying to come up with the keywords that kind of inspiring us to move forward. Then based on these keywords, we're searching references, and based on those references, we're creating our first sketch. And then there is a stage of the free visualization when we go through the complete freedom of experimentation using this information previously discovered, in order to then come up with the final description of the idea, and then move forward with this idea without necessarily changing it too much, but just making it better. So because of the importance of the stage, again, this stage kind of finalizes the idea as the final thing, and because of its finality, we need to make sure that it's going to look right. We need to make sure that it's going to be properly well established as a pipeline. Because again, like what I'm considering right now and what I'm working with free visualization, it considers this kind of subject like third pass of visual brainstorming, strictly visual brainstorming, when we're taking our original idea and we coming up with so many unique and different variations that might shift this idea, it might make this idea into something more, and etc. And the only way to do this is to have this creative freedom, not being held by those frames that we established before, which I did before. I actually created those things as a strict frames and didn't know how to move forward from them. I kind of was, okay, I can't move forward from the A, I can move forward from the B, I have to make sure that C is going to work perfectly. It's kind of a restrictive way of creating. It's not necessarily gives us a creative freedom on a brainstorming stage. And we actually I established this when I worked on Emily. I went through the stage and I didn't create that many variations because I established the controlled way of creation, but I want to make sure that this stage is going to be as free as possible. And in order to make it as free as possible, we have to have less elements of control. And having just a shape, just a gesture, and slightly depicted form, and finding a way to tell the emotional story with those small design decisions. This is storytelling and design, combining those pieces together in a simple way. This is going to be a quite Interesting topic. So yeah, and then we're going to maintain the same quality of the work once we will start to work with composition. So I don't believe that we're going to make things much more complex in the compositional stage. So going into the compositional stage, it's still going to be a first stage of the visualization. We're still going to work with abstract symbolic way of visualizing. It's still going to be this first stage, and we're going to think about form and lighting only when we will get to a third stage, which is lighting, when we'll try to analyze lighting, place it, analyze it, etc. To this point we already have to have a strict idea. The only thing that we need to make with lighting right here is to make sure that we're going to create this emotional appeal and make it believable and make it make it pop out from the canvas as something realistic. So again, everything that I'm talking about is kind of vague still. It's going to be much interesting if we're going to try it in practice, and I'm definitely wanting to do so. But again, it's a slow process, step by step. Like, I understand my process more and more. One of the things, by the way, that disrupted this process is one of the reasons why we're struggling so much with this stage right now, with this free visualization, because I didn't implement this element of freedom into my creative process. It was super controlled right from the beginning. And working with abstract and symbolism and actually learning what gesture actually is, it basically changed my perception of the gesture, and now understanding how strong this thing is, how strong shapes are, and how to combine those together we could achieve greatness, a type of greatness. It basically opened my eyes to, okay, I have flaws in my process, now we need to update it. And this is the reason why we kind of back again right here. We actually kind of started pretty weirdly. We started backwards. We first worked on simplification of the complex anatomy for the fourth stage, which is based on anatomical accuracy. Then the next thing we have to work with lighting. But before working with lighting, I want to make sure that we're going to work with the concepts with the free visualization stage. Because again, as I said before, this is the most important two stages, mostly this first one, because the better we will create the first stage, the better result, the more final result is going to be, the easier we're going to experiment with composition. Because the rest is just placement of the camera, zooming, panning, scaling, changing angles, and etc. So if we have a strong idea, we could experiment with angles and with rotation, with composition as much as we want to without that many restrictions. That's kind of it for today, I guess. So yeah, we will continue to work on this tomorrow. Again, tomorrow is going to be a relatively short stream because of the two streams in a row. So today's stream was quite short too, but still. So I believe I established most of the things that I wanted to establish. So the rest thing that we need to think about is just how to work with those things. So how to make sure that the gesture is going to be used in a proper way. We need to consider exaggeration somehow. We need to consider and actually add balance and add dynamic. The rest is just finding a proper way to integrate all those things that we talked about. So now at least I have the confidence in what I need to do. And the only thing that I need to do now is to find a way how to do it better and something like this. So again, we established our theoretical stuff. Now, I guess we have to go into like practical stuff and figure out the rest. On this note, we're going to end the session. Thank you for watching. Спасибо Бобу-да-Бобу-да за то, что посетили нас. Приятного времени. И... Yep. Where's Tony? I forgot how it's supposed to end. I'm super tired. So yeah, thank you for watching, thank you for being here, have a nice day or night, and see you in the next session, which is again in English, it's going to be tomorrow. Tony says bye, I'm saying bye too, I guess bye.